Something I'd like to point out about Proverbs, we have chosen verses in each topic, but that doesn't mean that's an exhaustive selection. Some topics are covered with too much material to fit into one class session. Other topics have very few verses. But whatever Proverbs says carries a lot of weight because it is the wisdom of God. And it's a timeless wisdom, and it's a wisdom which is not tied to theology so much as it is to how we should live our lives. And what real wisdom is following the path that God has given for us. Men, women, and children. We're going to study families today and marriage in some detail. And remember that this advice is regarded as the wisdom, and people who reject this advice, go their own way, follow whatever the world has decided is the best path for our lives, are regarded as fools. So foolishness is not following what God has said. It's not constructing your life around God's principles, God's ethics, God's morality. Doesn't matter whether the world thinks it's got a greater morality that gives you more freedom and more enjoyment. The real enjoyment comes from doing it God's way. You go the way of the world, and sooner or later, you're going to create problems for yourself. You're going to be miserable to some degree or other. And so we see this constant assault on God's way of doing things. It's not new. Proverbs, written in the time of Solomon, who collected these, is ancient, and yet its precepts are valid today. And a lot of people, if something's old, they think it's not worth very much. And so they want to ignore it. We'll go the modern way. But that doesn't always end up well. And so when we think of God's instruction for the family, the husband, the wife, the children, a lot of those things are being ignored today. The world has a better way of doing it, it thinks. And the world is in a mess because of it. And so don't think that we're going to be looked at favorably because we follow God's path. We're regarded as out of date, out of fashion, and we just don't understand what people should be doing. One of the ways in which the world educates us is through the media. It used to be the newspapers and the magazines. Now it's the internet and television. Streaming services offer all kinds of designs for man's life. And you look at the way it is destroying the family. And just as a nation survives because of its good families, so the church is going to survive because of its good families, good family arrangement. And the world is against that totally. Show after show will tell you that young couples, first they should hook up, then maybe have a child, then maybe buy a home, and then finally think about religion because they want their children brought up as believers, which is weird. Why didn't the parents give that example throughout their lives instead of just suddenly deciding when they're about to enter school, at whatever level, 3 or 4 years old, that all of a sudden we want Christian morality taught. It doesn't make sense and it doesn't work out well. And so I'd like to lead with Proverbs chapter 6 and look at verses 20 to 22. And see how many things we can pick up in this short collection of Proverbs statements. My son, observe the commandment of your father, and do not forsake the teaching of your mother. That says a few things about the family. This may be addressed to the son, but that's because of a Hebrew liking for the masculine above the feminine. I don't know why, don't ask me why, it's just what I learned from Hebrew. It's not the children of Israel, it's the sons of Israel in the original. It's just the way their grammar goes. And so this would apply to all children. Observe the commandment of your father. So what does a family need? Who should be doing the teaching? Who is responsible for the teaching? It's the father. But also, do not forsake the teaching of your mother. So, united front on the part of parents. Father and mother are both involved in teaching. A lot of families leave it to one or the other. They leave it to mother very often. But sometimes mother wants to pass it off to the father. You know, my kids were told a time or two, you wait until your father gets home. So both are needed to offer correction, offer direction, and instruction. It says, verse 21, bind them continually on your heart, tie them around your neck. So whatever mother and father teach, or everything that mother and father teach, you need to hold close to you. You need to remember them. They need to be committed to your memory. And sometimes correction and discipline is needed to impress those teachings on the child. And what the child will very often look for is example. Are you doing this? You expect me to do this, but you won't do it. And all sorts of things happen. Children have a way of demanding the food they like, and so they often neglect food that's really healthy for them, and they love food that's really bad for them. And our nation has food guidance, which is just way off track. You know, the government designed it, and whatever the government designs could be problematic. And so we have an obesity epidemic in the country. Why? Because the Food and Drug Administration has been advising us how to eat. Then in verse 22, when you walk about, they will guide you. When you sleep, they will watch over you. And when you awake, they will talk to you. This is the guidance, the instruction from your parents. It's going to be there to help you, whatever's happening. How do you imagine that they will watch over you when you sleep? There's some intriguing questions arise. What is he getting at? What does he mean by this? And there's no pat answer. I can't tell you. You have to work it out for yourself. And perhaps if you've been living according to God's plan, you won't have stuff that you have to worry about. Your mind won't have to wake you up at 2 in the morning and say, we need to worry about this, which very often happens to me. And so when you wake, they will talk to you. And you will remember the precepts. I need to get up. I need to prepare in time for my breakfast, for my journey to work or school, for the activities that will be involved there. Verse 23, the commandment is a lamp, and the teaching is light. And reproof for discipline are the way of life. You don't realize how often or how much you depend on light until you get a power cut. I woke up at about 10 minutes to 2 this morning to total blackness and silence. We had a power cut. Aircon was out, all the lights were off. I had a beeping from one of my appliances, one of my uninterruptible power supplies, which was complaining that it wasn't getting any power. But I had to stumble around in the dark after I'd silenced that. So light is really necessary. Light is what produces our food. Light is what guides us. It protects us. And we know that God, through Jesus Christ, was the light of the world. And so we need his guidance constantly. And so that's the basic idea, is that we need to be taught the ways of God, and we need to carry those ways around with us and remember them. One of the most controversial issues in a family is discipline. First, some parents just avoid trying to discipline at all. The child gets to rule the house, say what has to be done, what we have to eat, and where we have to go, and when we have to go, and so it goes. The child just wants what it wants. Now, one of the noisiest people at the table the last few days, since we've had great-grandchildren with us, is little Mason, just a few months old. She is the loudest person at the table. She wants her food now, and she will shout until she gets it. And as soon as she's finished that mouthful, she's shouting again. So you better keep the food coming quickly. And so some people realize that that's natural. This is what babies don't know, how to express themselves and bargain for when they will get things. But they know how to demand them. But a lot of people allow children to get away without any discipline, or when they do apply discipline, they apply it because they think it's necessary, but in such light doses that the child doesn't appreciate they're being disciplined at all. In chapter 3, back up there, and look at verse 12. Whom the Lord loves, he reproves, even as a father corrects the son in whom he delights. So discipline comes from the Lord, first of all, and we parents, we adults, are disciplined by the Lord. Sometimes we don't realize how this is being done, but sometimes we decide there's something we want to do, and it's frustrated. We just don't get it. We just don't get to do what we want to do. We think we know exactly how we're going to serve the Lord and sign up for something, and the Lord says, I'm not going to support that. And it's his discipline. He does not allow what he doesn't want us to do. But it's paralleled with even as a father corrects the son in whom he delights. And so that's an indicator that if you really love your child, you're going to discipline the child as necessary. And discipline, we sometimes think as something painful, of necessity. And for some children, that's the way it has to be. But others are not at all corrected by that kind of discipline. My brother would rather have his legs attacked with a switch than be restricted. I remember once my mother was fed up with his behavior and said, okay, and this was about 3 in the afternoon. She said, okay, you're going to bed now. I'll bring you your supper in bed. No books, nothing. We didn't have television, and he did not have access to a radio, so there was no input at all. It was just solitary confinement to his bed until the next morning. And he said, oh, rather give me a thrashing. He could withstand that, but he couldn't stand this discipline which restricted his activity. A timeout, a primitive form of timeout, that he couldn't stand. And so you have to find which button to push for the particular child. And it's not the same button on every child, and it doesn't always work that way. But what you have to find that in some way, by controlling his activities and impressing on him that that is what will happen unless he changes his pattern of thinking and obedience. And then chapter 13, I think I mentioned that these particular passages on a topic are not all gathered in one place in the book of Proverbs. They are scattered throughout, and it's helpful to have a list of all of these, and I found one that somebody created on a spreadsheet, and it's a huge list and hundreds and hundreds of verses. But hopefully by looking at these on a topic basis, we'll get better information for ourselves. So, Proverbs 13 and verse 1, a wise son accepts his father's discipline, but a scoffer does not listen to rebuke. So, here it's paralleling that the person who is dedicated to following God's way with the one who's decided God's way is not what he wants to do. And he's not going to listen to reproof. He's not going to listen to correction. I know how I should go, and you don't. You don't understand me, is often the cry. And so while this is talking about a son, it's really talking about one of the people who's following God. And he accepts the Father's discipline. He accepts what the Father wants us to control and how he wants us to live. Whereas the person who's opted for the world is just not going to listen. And so very often it's futile to try and discuss with them and change their minds about these things because they're not going to listen. And the same is true of people whose thinking has been kind of twisted a little bit today. They believe any kind of theory that's floated around. They don't research it to see whether it's valid or not. They grab onto it, and that's what they're going to do, and that's what they're going to believe. And it's futile to discuss it with them. They'll always just evade any kind of attention or giving any attention. And so the wise son accepts the discipline. Chapter 13 again. And can I have a reader for verse 18? Chapter 13, verse 18.
Chapter 13?
Yes.
Verse 18?
Yes.
Poverty and shame shall be to him that refuses instruction, but he that regardeth reproof shall be honored.
Okay. For instruction, read discipline, which is the original word. Poverty and shame will come to him who neglects discipline. So discipline is often in the form of instruction. This is what you need to do, and you should not do anything else. And those who regard reproof will be honored. So the person who's going to follow God will receive honor. And the person who doesn't is headed for shame in some form or fashion. Then go to verse 24. We have a reader for that.
He that spareth his rod hateth his son, but he that who that loveth him chasteneth him betimes.
Okay. I love that. I love that English word betimes. Diligently. So withholds his rod, hates his son. He who loves him disciplines him diligently. It's not as if you've got some kind of rod, like a part of a fishing rod. Incidentally, my mother used a part of a fishing rod, one of those old-fashioned rods that's made of solid cane with brass ferrules. I was whinging about something I wanted to do, and she said, "No, this is not the time you should do it." And I insisted that I was going to do it. She said, "All right, I will give you a beating and you can go, or you can just stay at home and everything's going to be okay." So I said, "Well, I'll take the beating." Mistake. She took the rod to me. I had little blue marks on my legs that I was proud to demonstrate to the guy next door that I went to visit. And of course, it was the wrong time to visit him. He was about to have supper. So all of that punishment was, I'd suffered needlessly. It would have been just better to stay at home and do what I should do. But I must tell you that this word rod was the way the translators like to render it. It's much better to understand it as a switch. This is not massive punishment like they used to give prisoners in the jail. This is just go and get a switch off the tree. Because sometimes you can make a mistake and get the wrong kind of switch and end up in trouble. But it's not a huge punishment. It's just a discipline which says, don't do that. It's not the thing you should be doing. Okay. We're going to go now to, Proverbs 19. I didn't write in the verse, so I'm going to have to find it quickly. Proverbs 19. Verse 18. It's a good one.
I'm going to do this one.
Okay.
Do a American Standard.
Okay.
19 verse 18.
Yes.
Discipline your son while there is hope, and do not desire his death.
Okay. There are times when there are things you need to warn your children not to do. Don't stick a pair of scissors into the socket. and discipline him or instruct him or guide him while there's hope. You leave it and say, okay, well, you just try and distract him instead of letting him actually do it. And eventually he says, oh, I wonder why she keeps dragging, or wonder why my dad keeps dragging me away from the socket. So I'll see what happens when I stick that in. And it can be fatal. So there is instruction you need to give your child while there's hope. These days, if you're getting out of the car, you want to instruct your child, stay with you and hold my hand until he's really old enough that the habit is firmly established. Kids can get killed so easily these days. Motorists are in a hurry. Proverbs 22:15, one we have to read.
Foolishness is bound up in the heart of a child. A lot of discipline will remove it far from him.
And again, that rod of discipline is like a switch. You're not going to brutalize the child at all. In fact, the disciplinary method is not as important as the fact that you do apply discipline. You know, no ice cream for you tonight. So the rod of discipline will remove it far from him. Children just want what they want. They have got no self-control at all. They're not born with self-control, as you know. And so what our responsibility is to teach them self-control. Self-control according to God's will. Not according to what the world, oh, but my friends are allowed. Yes, but you're not. And why? Because we're trying to follow God's way of doing things. And they need to understand that it's not a negotiable thing. It is what we're going to do. We brought our children up to realize that they were going to attend church. There wasn't any discussion about it. It wasn't up for debate. They came to church. As long as they lived under our roof, they came to church. And that was it. So they so accepted it and so enjoyed all the friends they had at church that it really eventually was no problem at all. The problem was getting them away from church. I remember we had to load up the car after church, and always one kid was off talking to other kids. And so finally we told him, look, we're going to eventually leave, because we stood around and talked as well. And I said, you have to watch us. We don't have to come and find you wherever you are. So you keep an eye on us, and when you see us moving towards the car, come. Don't think you can stop and talk until we shout out and come searching for you. And one day, we were driving off the church property when he came bounding over the flower beds to get in the car. But you have to establish the discipline you want. And then finally on children, Proverbs 23, we're going to have to get on to the rest of marriage next time. But Proverbs 23 verses 13 and 14, I think are very important.
You shall strike him with a rod and rescue his soul.
No, go back to 13 first.
13.
13 and 14.
Okay.
Great.
Do not hold back this one, little child. Although you strike him with the rod, he will not die. You shall strike him with the rod and rescue his soul from Sheol.
Yeah.
My son.
That's okay. Fine. That's great. So don't hold back discipline. Sometimes we think, I'm tired of pleading with this kid. I'm tired of trying to get him to do what's right. And he's hoping that you've reached that stage, because now he's going to get away with what he wants. And so don't hold back discipline. And the next statement, although you strike him with a rod, he will not die. Kids pretty soon learn, if you're applying any kind of physical discipline, if they scream and shout enough, you'll stop before they really feel the discipline. And so discipline has to be appreciated by the child as some restriction on their activities or some other punishment. They have to understand that it's there, it's unpleasant, and I don't want to go through that again. A lot of children get such a tiny little pat that they don't recognize it as discipline, but they know if they scream enough, you'll stop. So it needs to be felt and appreciated and recognized as something to avoid by doing what your parents want.
I remember a time when I was growing up, I was about 11 or 12, and I decided, this time I'm going to show my mom that it doesn't hurt. I'm not going to cry. I'm not going to cry, no matter how hard she beats me. But you know what I learned? You better cry.
Yeah.
Because she's not going to stop.
I remember our youngest son was told he had to be home at 6 p.m. And he just deliberately flaunted the instruction. And my wife had given the instruction. And she decided that she'd had enough because he'd constantly violated this be back by such a time, because supper would be ready, nice and hot. And he decided he would stay out. And he came back and she said, "Go to your room." And he knew that she was going to punish him, but he kind of flaunted himself as if to say, well, what can you do? He sadly misunderstood his mother because she always had flip-flops, and she took a flip-flop off. Now, it's not going to do much damage, but that popping sound and the stinging certainly had an effect on him. And I finally thought, I'd better go and stop her before she kills him. Yes?
I think that's really well how it's nursing fathers and mothers. Mothers are more patient, and they keep thinking, oh, the situation will change on its own, where fathers just deal with it and it's over.
Yeah.
But I have a lot of guilt for that, because I felt a lot of inconsistency.
Yes.
I think that's it. You just be patient, and then you get discipline them, and then that seems to be inconsistent to what you just take care of it to begin with them and never, or hopefully not occur again.
If you're consistent and both parents are involved in applying this discipline, because they try and play one off against the other, and they regard mother's instruction, she let me get away with it. Dad's another question. So we had to lay down the principle that if she gave an instruction, it was just as strong as if it was mine. And but you learn as you go along. Yeah. Okay. We're not time up yet. We're going to look at now the ideal husband. The book of Proverbs is probably famous for its praise of the woman in chapter 31. But in that, there are a lot of statements which indicate that the husband treasures his wife. And it's a necessary function that he do appreciate his wife. And so if we turn to Proverbs 31, we'll look at a few verses from that passage. This is from Lemuel, and it is what is called an acrostic. So from verse 10 down to verse 23, every verse begins with a letter of the Hebrew alphabet. It begins with Aleph, Beit, Gimel, and so on through the whole Hebrew alphabet. So it's a way they had of structuring things so that they would be easier to remember. Because they didn't all have a copy of a scroll that they could read this from. In fact, scrolls were very expensive and somewhat rare. The synagogue had a scroll, and maybe the synagogue school had a scroll, but you couldn't carry a scroll around and read it. It was a big, bulky thing. You had to roll it out to find the place. It's not like sitting there with your phone or your Bible and looking the verse up easily. So they made things that were easy to memorize. And so in this description of a worthy woman, we have a few statements which I think apply to the husband as well. Verse 31 says, "Give her the product of her hands, let her works praise her in the gates." And so whatever the wife produces with her hands, appreciate that and give her credit for that. A lot of people just accept what the wife does and say, well, that's what she's supposed to do. No, it needs to be appreciated. And that means a tremendous amount more than you imagine. And so verses 28 and 29, her children rise up and bless her, her husband also, and he praises her, saying, many daughters have done nobly, but you excel them all. And so that needs to be said, and it needs to be said with all the sincerity that's possible. In verse 11, or I'll read verse 10 and 11. An excellent wife who can find, for her worth is far above jewels. The heart of her husband trusts in her, and he will have no lack of gain. And so trust is one of the ingredients of a stable relationship, and one in which there is a minimum of discord. Trust is absolutely essential. But the way of the world today is such that there are seldom reasons in worldly marriages for trust. It's not thought necessary. I'll do what I want, regardless of whether I expect my husband to trust me. And so the heart of the husband trusts in her, and he will have no lack of gain. Okay. Okay. I think that's enough on that point. And so we need to begin to look at 31 from the standpoint of the woman, the ideal wife, the worthy woman. Just following the verse we read, 11, we're going to read 12. It says, still talking about the excellent wife, she does him good and not evil all the days of her life. And so that faithfulness, doing good is faithfulness, is also a very important aspect of the family, where husband and wife trust each other. They're parents who will teach their children trust and also teach their children what they should look for in a marriage. And very often, children learn or have learned from the mistakes that they saw in their parents how to be better. And that makes for good marriages if we're wise. One of the things that's important to the whole family is the trust of the parents one for the other. Where that breaks down and there's a lot of quarreling and loud fights, that's something that terrorizes children. And it makes them feel unstable. And when they feel unstable, then they're likely to try and find some solace in some worldly habit or other. It turns children into drug addicts very often, and often into seeking immorality of some kind, to find some acceptance elsewhere when they think, my family's breaking up, what will I do? Where will I find security? And so we need to be very careful about our interaction with each other. I'm going to continue with the rest of this next time, and also we will then go on to the next topic. Next topic is work, which a lot of people like to avoid. Thank you for your patience.